One in Three is intended for mature audiences. Episodes contain explicit content and may be triggering as they often include violence and other varying forms of abuse, such as emotional, psychological, sexual, and physical. In most cases, names have been changed to protect all involved. Please note, statements and opinions of guests do not necessarily reflect those of my own. Hi, warriors. Welcome to One in Three. I'm your host, Ingrid. Justice looks different for everyone. For some, it may mean seeing their offender face legal consequences, but that kind of justice isn't always possible. As my guest today, Kath, so beautifully puts it, justice is finding peace. Here's Kath. Hi, Kath. Welcome to One in Three. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
And so before we get into our conversation, could you give just a little bit of a background on yourself so everyone gets to know you some?
Hi, everyone. My name's Kath, and I am a mother of two. I live at Bells Beach in Australia, down on the bottom of Australia. I'm an author and speaker, and I've just recently published a book called The Courage to Speak Your Truth, Shifting the Narrative on Childhood Sexual Abuse. So that's what we're here to talk about today.
Yes, and there's a lot to talk about. Now, quickly, is the book, I listened to it on Audible and Spotify, but is there a hard copy of it available as well?
There is a hard copy, and you can get that on Amazon or Booktopia.
Okay, perfect. So let's start with what made you decide to write the book?
I think more the book decided to use me as its vehicle, to be honest. That's how it felt. This is my second book that I've published, and I always knew that I wanted to use my story as a way to inform and educate. About 2 years ago, I decided I wanted to do a TED Talk. So I spent 3 months working with a coach to define how that messaging would look and what those 18 minutes would look like. And when I presented that talk, I realized I had the blueprint for a book. So when I came home, literally 4 weeks later, the book was finished. So I sort of went into a bit of a writing frenzy, and the only block I had was really, where does the story start and end? Because obviously it's my story, so it's never ending, but I feel that part of the story that I've shared so far, there is a bookend to the beginning and end of the journey of remembering, recovering, and reporting my abuse. And I feel like that's the part that people need to be informed about.
Right. Now, your abuse, you had repressed the memory for quite some time.
Yes, which is actually statistically pretty average. My story, on many accounts, it was a male relative that abused me. My abuse, the first incident happened when I was 5, and there were 2 major incidents that followed that. I had suppressed it completely. I did know that I was uncomfortable about this person's presence, but I I had suppressed it into my early 20s, and it came back like a tsunami. And the reason I explored what was there was because depression had come knocking, and for no apparent reason. So it's like a part of myself had been switched off so that the rest of me could function. And I functioned really well until I couldn't ignore the knock anymore.
One thing you mentioned in the book was how it was like you had to relive the trauma again. You lived it once when you went through it, repressed it, and then when all the memories came back, it was just having to relive it all again.
And in some ways, relive it for the first time, because when you see an experience from adult eyes, it's a very different, childhood trauma is so complex because we don't have the reference point or language or understanding of what's happening often, particularly when it comes to sexual abuse. At 5 years old, there's no context to violence, least of all sexual violence. And to add to the complexity that 90% of us who are abused as children know our perpetrator, and 50% of us are related to that perpetrator, it just adds another layer of complexity that a little mind can't possibly make sense of. So making sense of it as an adult took a different lens, but the healing of that little girl within me is what had to happen after I made sense of the incidents themselves.
Well, and I imagine it makes you look back at your life and question a lot of things in your life too, right?
Absolutely. And also honor a lot, to think that those things were happening. And alongside those incidents, I was very fortunate. I didn't live with my abuser, which many people do. Um, I had a lovely, happy, fun life. And so, these incidents can shape us, but in my case, I've chosen for it not to define me in a way that holds me back. It's definitely part of my identity because I'm now talking about it so much publicly, but it is only one piece of the puzzle of who I am. And that's the way I see trauma. Like, all of us have a story, and they're vastly different stories, but we have to come to peace with our own so that we can navigate the rest of life and enjoy ourselves.
Another part that I liked is you talked about your mom and how she was a woman who was just very like what is I'm trying to think feminist I guess in a
Yeah.
way, but always out for like equality for everyone.
And the reason I like to talk about mum is because I I feel like there's a misunderstanding about what it means for children who suppress their abuse as children, and that there's an assumption that the children had nowhere to go to share their story. Um, that wasn't the case for me. I know that as an adult, had I have come forward and told my mum what was happening, I know she would have heard me and listened and taken action. But I think that often these perpetrators are so skillful in the way that they pick their victims and also pick their weak spots. So I was an innate people pleaser. I didn't want anyone to be unhappy. I loved my family. I loved the community I was involved in. And I didn't want to wreck that for anybody. So, being in a family with a woman who was so overt about justice wasn't enough to break through that suppression for me, because this was in my family. This was very different to fighting a good fight for a group of people. This was my story. And, they talk about how, in no other situation other than sexual violence are the victims really put under scrutiny. If someone breaks into your house and steals your TV, people aren't saying, well, the owner, it's their fault because they shouldn't have had that TV in the first place. But when we have sexual violence, there's a really complex way in which we navigate that in our society. And I think that's why the suppression is there for so many of us.
Well, it's difficult to even talk to your family because you're especially when it is family because
That's right.
you're unsure of how they're going to react to that.
Absolutely. And, I did mention in the book that my abuser was in my dad's side of the family, whom I was estranged from as soon as I was able to make that happen. And I still didn't come forward. Like, I think there's so many people that have read my book and reached out to me and told me that their abuser is still in their lives and they don't know what to do about that other than protecting their own children. And that may seem really simple to someone outside, but when it's your whole existence and you're choosing between having a relationship with your own parents because you have to tell them that one of their parents or siblings was your abuser, it's very, very complicated, and much more complicated than a simple I've spoke up or I didn't speak up.
Did your family react the way you thought they would react when they found out?
Yes, I think there's a lot of shock, and particularly, part of the reason I called the book Shifting the Narrative on Childhood Sexual Abuse is because I want to shift the narrative of what a victim or a survivor looks like, and also a perpetrator. So I think we have this bias and assumption about what we think a survivor of this type of crime looks like, but we also have a bias about what the perpetrators look like, hence why so many get away with what they do. And so I think for me, when I first came forward, because I'd been out of character and like really depressed, and that seemed really unusual for me and my vibrancy and personality, I think it helped make sense of why I had been spiraling down for a little while. But I also think it was really challenging for people who knew me well to calibrate the happy, athletic, popular girl having that going on in the background.
Yeah, I imagine so. And then your parents were already divorced, right?
That's right, yes.
And did it draw like bigger lines in the sand or more resentment toward the other opposite families?
Look, I think I had already, I had to choose. When I came forward, I told my dad and asked him to inform the rest of the family because there were still children in that family. Beyond that, I didn't actually have a relationship with my own dad before he died 10 years later. So that was really challenging. And that wasn't because he didn't believe me. It was because it was his family and he didn't know how to manage that. So that was a big decision for him. And I trust that and feel very strongly that there was intergenerational trauma. So I think if you are an adult and haven't dealt with your own story, then it's very hard to support a child who's ready to confront their own.
Oh, absolutely. Generational trauma definitely carries, and it's difficult to stop it, especially if you're so immersed in it, and it's difficult to recognize. And if you don't have the exterior support from other family members, I imagine it would be very, very difficult
Oh,
to stop.
awful. And I think that's why people often leave. That's their only sort of line of defense, is to get out and start again. And I'm grateful that I only lost half of my family in coming forward. There's people that I know that have had to walk away from their entire families because they're not ready to confront the often generations of misuse and abuse that's happened.
One thing I loved, again, so going back again to your mom, is how you mentioned how, in awe you were of her with her fight for justice, and then you taking your children to the Me Too. Was it a march, or was it just like a gathering?
Yeah, it was a protest gathering on the beach, and um, my son was 6 and my daughter was 10, and I stood there, and it's really important to me, I think, to join. The numbers of abuse seemingly statistically are less for men on paper, but I do believe that's only because we aren't really inviting men to speak up about it, and often there's extra layers of shame when it's a male perpetrator. And so I really want to bring up a strong, empathetic man. And I wanted my son to sort of be joined into this conversation that I'm having with my daughter. But I stood there at this march, and when I saw the word justice being formed in front of me, I realized that was something I hadn't done for myself. And I felt like a bit of a hypocrite, actually. And when I looked at my children, I thought, if they ever come to me and something's happened, I want to be able to tell them that I did everything I could to ensure that the person who hurt me was brought to justice. And so that's when, at that day, I dropped them to school and I walked straight into the police station locally, and that started the process.
Could you talk a little bit about that process and what it entailed, and the length and the headaches and
Sure.
all of the.
So it was an 18-month process from that first day walking in. And, I'm quite a spiritual person. And I, I felt like it was often a bit like an out of body experience, and I was being held, and I felt very safe to do that, but I was terrified. So I walked in and I spoke to that first detective, and the first thing he said to me is, let's just check if your perpetrator is still alive. And it kind of threw me, actually, because it hadn't occurred to me that he wouldn't be. And so I feel very grateful that he was. And I got referred to a specialized historical sexual assault unit and worked with a detective. And part of the process was me giving my statement. And that took 4 hours to, in detail, describe the incidents that happened. And the reason it's so important is because every word matters. And So that was pretty grueling, and I'd never done that before. I realized that I was curating my story for my husband and my parents and my siblings because I didn't want anyone else to have to carry the heaviness of this story. So I curated it through language, I curated it through giving bits and pieces to different people. But one thing I got to do in that investigation was call my perpetrator and confront him. And so there was a 12-minute conversation between us, and it was liberating and terrifying. And I think I'd done so much healing and so much work that there really was nothing more for me to do than step through that process. So I did, and um, it, it allowed me to reclaim my voice and to really assert my certainty around the fact that you did not break me. And the problem here sits with you, and the shame here sits with you. It's not mine to carry, and I hand it back. And so it was a very powerful part of the process. It's definitely not for everybody, but and it took me, decades to get to the point where that was something that I wanted and needed. And I'm very grateful that I had an opportunity to do that. Unfortunately, because there wasn't enough evidence, there was evidence that they couldn't find of me being admitted to hospital after an incident happened when I was 11, but they couldn't find records of that. There was an eyewitness who is also related to the perpetrator who just wasn't prepared to give a statement. And there was also a discrepancy between my 4-hour interview in which I used the word rape and the 3 friends of mine that were interviewed, whom I first disclosed to 23 years earlier. And they all used the word abused because that's the word that I used when I first told them something had happened. So they suggested that in court, the defense would have ripped that apart. And so collectively, we couldn't go to trial. So although he was arrested, he can't be charged. And part of me at that point was relieved that I felt I'd done what I needed to do. But then I have days where, as a mother and a woman, I feel angry that things are still set up to protect those type of people. And particularly in these cases where the reality is lots of people take decades to get ready to confront it, then it's really set up for many of us to fail.
It really is. And especially on when you think about words, because one, in your 20s versus in your 40s, especially after decades of healing, you're going to be more comfortable and confident using a stronger word like rape. But when it's first coming to you, that's a very difficult word to use. I know with my abuser, I had a very hard time telling him the word rape. I described to him what he had done to me, and he said, "It sounds like you're calling me a rapist." And I said, "I think that is actually the term I'm looking for." So it's very frustrating that a technicality of using rape versus abuse that far apart in time, plus that early in recognition of what happened versus that much long later healing wise, of course, the terms are going to be different.
Absolutely. And, this ties back, doesn't it, into our societal messaging about what rape is. And, we are brought up as men and women to believe that it's a stranger who abuses somebody in a dark alley. Like that's almost how it's not somebody known to the victim, it's not someone related to the victim. Like it's like we're having to reshape what that word actually means. And in addition to that, I actually hadn't remembered. It took another probably 5 or 6 years of therapy for me to remember the last incident. So the word wasn't even in my vocabulary around these incidents at that stage when I first disclosed. So, there needs to be more trauma-informed understanding in the legal system for sure.
So, one thing you mentioned is how you didn't tell your family and friends exactly what happened because you were afraid of how they would react to that. And I think that's very common. amongst survivors of any form of trauma or abuse is well, it's not sugarcoating, because it's certainly not making it a nice situation, but you're leaving some of the bigger parts out, or some of the actual stronger verbs or words. But do you think, is that one of the reasons you wanted to put it into a book as well? Or, I mean, not necessarily waiting for your family to read the book, but just a way to sort of get your words out there beyond the police report?
I think once I verbalized it to police, I well and truly had told the people that mattered before the book came out. You know, that many people, my husband, best friends, my mum and auntie, like they all read the book well before I, you know, that it came out. They saw my speech in which I reference rape in that. I found it that part of the reason I put it off for so long is I wasn't ready for my children to know because of their development. So I hit a point where I was waited for that to be okay. If it's ever okay, I don't know. But a huge part of my motivation for doing this is to stop my children's intergenerational trauma. My healing is about their healing too, and I'm very confident that I've done that. They have a very safe home and a great community of people around them, and we have very open conversations, and so that's important to me. The book, as I said, almost birthed itself, and it just came through me in the way that it ended up presenting itself in a lot of my poetry that I've put into the book is how I would make sense of the words that would float and the feelings. You know, anyone who's had childhood trauma understands that it's not like a movie of start to finish. There's fragments that you see and feel and smell, and so it's like a puzzle. I liken it to a puzzle that you've got to put together. And there's still pieces missing for me completely that I may never get back. But there's enough there for me to have a pretty accurate picture, and also to know that the shame isn't mine to carry. And I couldn't keep protecting people in my life because this was hard for them, because it was drawing a wedge between myself and them, and that was too much for me to bear.
So about the poetry, I've not read a book like this before, but I really liked how you would write a certain part and then end that chapter with a poem, and that poem almost made it. I'm trying to think of the word. Actually, maybe I wrote it down. It was, oh yeah, it was almost, it kind of gave you this like, okay, I just read about what happened to a child, and it's difficult, but then the poem made it more reaffirming, almost like reassuring, like, okay, and it summarized it too, I think, really well. And it almost gave you that, like, okay, I can tackle this next chapter and find out what happens in the next chapter. I really thought that the poems added so much to the book.
Oh, thank you. Well, many of those poems were written in moments of crisis. And so the way that I put the book together was sometimes I already had the poem. And, as an example, in there's a poem when I was deep in depression. And so I wrote a chapter about depression based on the poem that I wrote 10 years ago. And in another case, there was a poem there that my mum and sister had messaged me when I went and saw police, and I gave my first initial statement, and they asked me if I was okay, and the poem just came through me in the car, so that's what I responded to them. So I used that in the book to show that that's how and it's it's interesting because it's hard to remember sometimes even who we were yesterday and what persona we had, and I find sometimes poetry helps me go back to those places really effortlessly, and so I hope that's the role that they played in the book for readers.
Did you write poems before, or is that okay?
it's a way that I've healed really forever. And I've got friends who joke with me that they go through all their old cards and letters from high school, and they're like, we just can't throw yours out because they're so beautiful. So I've always loved writing, and poetry for me is just how I make sense of, I think, some very deep feelings. And I've never shared them before. It's not something I ever intended to share, but it is how I've made sense of what's going on for me. And I often share that with people in moments to make sense of, where I'm experiencing life.
Okay, so you said how poetry kind of helped you get through parts. Did writing the rest of the book also help in some of your healing process?
It absolutely did. It gave me a sense of empowerment. And I think it's really helped me understand the degrees of healing and the layers in which we need to navigate. For me, I had chronic tonsillitis as a teenager, and I look back now and I remember thinking one day a lot of these strange physical elements will make sense. And I look back now and I really do think that there was just so much suppression and there was so much I was holding back, and not just in the big ways, but in the small ways too, that sort of like I shaped myself into a being that was there to serve people, to make people happy, to keep the peace. And so then a lot of my communication was based on making sure that everything was okay. And what wasn't okay in the end was me. And I needed to start asserting my needs. And part of that was actually sharing my whole story, because I was feeling resentful and angry at people close to me for not understanding. But the truth is, they didn't have all of the information. So it was the story between us that blocked that connection. And so many people have said to me, I had no idea. And which of course they wouldn't, because if you haven't experienced this, you wouldn't want to think about this being a part of someone you care about's life. But it did actually create a really big wedge between myself and various people at different times of my life.
That's a really good point that you bring up because I think that is quite common in anyone who's experienced any form of abuse is a resentment toward those closest to you for not being able to read your mind.
Yes.
Really, I know when I first had gotten out of my relationship, I formed this little bubble of this protective bubble around myself. And then as I went on for that first year, I started realizing I was getting really angry with those closest to me because I was questioning their intentions. And I was like, don't you understand why I'm questioning this? Can't you understand after what I've been through, whatever. But yeah, I think that's probably I mean, at least you and I, but I think it's pretty common across the board for people to have that resentment just because you're not telling everyone what's going on. You're like you said, it's building up inside.
And, we can only understand so much. I've had friends who've passed away with cancer, and I've had friends who've had partners, break up marriages and have an affair. And, there's experiences that you sit back and witness and you learn from as a supporter and of those people surviving those things. But until you have witnessed it, we can't possibly have the reference point to have total empathy. And so I think, I had several miscarriages between my children. And I remember having people who would have a miscarriage then come to me and say, I just had no idea the depths of that sort of pain until I went through it. And, that's how we all navigate life. It's like we can't expect people to understand if we're not willing to share our experience in it. And really what we've got to do is stay open and hold space for each other. And that's really only the way for us to connect on a variety of stories that we're all carrying.
Not you don't have to get too personal into what you did for therapy, but did you go into therapy right after these memories started coming back to you?
Absolutely. Like, I joke about the fact that I have one foot in both the East and Western camps. Like, you name a therapy and I've tried it. And I don't shy away from talking about that, because that is why that I'm sitting here today with you with the strength that I have. And So everything from meditation to medication, I sort of joke about having. There's times when I really needed that initially supportive medication had to help me navigate the initial stages of my trauma, recovery. I did talk therapy for a long time, and then there was a point where that felt like it was counterintuitive to my own healing. So then I think the next phase for me was really to get into the energetic healing, because so much of what I carried was in my body. And so much of it was carried there because I disassociated during my incidents, that I left my body. So I had to then approach it from a more of a physical and spiritual sort of space, and exercise and eating well. And, I think if we look at our own healing, like through mind, body, and spirit, there's so many facets that need to be considered to be a well being. And talking is one aspect of it, but there are many others. And I just implore people to explore what feels right for them. And what feels right at one stage, or one therapist who feels great, may not be a good fit for the next stage of healing.
Oh, definitely. Is there anything that you would have done differently or wished you would have done differently?
I wished I had have trusted myself and trusted those closest to me sooner. But it is what it is, and it's easy to say that when you're on the other side of a response, but you just don't know until you are open and vulnerable with people how they're going to receive it. So I do wish that. I do also wish I had a book like this to have read before I went through the process, because which is part of the motivation for writing it. Couldn't find anything for specifically for adult survivors who had suppressed memories and wanted to go through a historical case. And I've been inundated with people since writing the book who have had similar experiences, but it feels like something we just don't talk about. And we're still shoving under the carpet because it's too hard, it's too scary to think about people that we're close to hurting our children. And we have to talk about it if we want the statistics and numbers to change.
Did anyone just try to discourage you from either reporting it or writing the book?
No, but there was a few people that said, you probably won't get the outcome that you want. And so is it worth it? So the first time I sat down with the detective, actually, he shared statistics with me that I've put in the book, which was, he said, look, they believe only 23% of historical cases and survivors come forward to report their crime. From that 23%, only 10% ever make it to court. And from those that are in the court, go through the justice system, only 1% will end in a conviction. So I definitely knew that that was a slim chance. But I think my advice to people would be, if they choose to go through this process, to be really clear on personally what they want to gain from it. For me, it was very much being given the opportunity to confront my abuser was very much, and so the police system facilitated that. And that was extremely difficult. I stayed in bed for 4 days after that conversation. It was like a immense psychotherapy session where pieces of me all just came together, and I let go of so much. But it was hard, but it was important. So I knew I needed that. Someone else may not. And so I think it's really important just to ensure that you are clear on what the objective is. And I think it's also important to understand that we can go to the police with this story and share it and not have it taken any further. I think that without the police having a picture of whom these perpetrators are in our society, how can they ever possibly be empowered to create change? And so collectively, I think it's really important that we do speak up, but it doesn't mean everyone wants to go through a full investigation or a trial.
I've actually had some interesting conversations with some individuals who there's technology that's being developed where people can start an account and more or less like use it as a journal as to this is what happened to me. And then you can either take it to the next step or you can just leave it at that. You can add to it, you can edit, whatever. I think that's going to be so helpful for victims and survivors.
Amazing. And I saw a documentary about the issue of American college rape culture, and that one of the women who was raped, I can't remember what college it was, but she was in technology and she created an app where individuals, because I think the statistics are that the rapists are often raping multiple victims. So to minimize the chances of that, she created a way in which you can file your case, and then when someone else triggers that name, then those two people get connected. And I think, in child sexual abuse, that would be powerful, because I'm sure in my case there's multiple victims, and that would make all the difference in this person going to jail if there was more than just my story.
Absolutely. And if you know that there's another victim out there, then you just feel even more empowered. And, perhaps the two of you or more than two of you can work not together. That sounds like you're making up a story, but join forces more or less to
And I
take
feel like
action.
for me, if anyone else needed that, like I feel like I've got what I needed. If anyone else needed that, then all of the work that I've done would support their case. And so that's really empowering and important to me to know that I can help someone else. I'm very fortunate. I have the resources and um, the support to do the healing that I've done. Not everyone has that. And so, even though these incidences are vastly different, so are the way in which we can heal. There's people that don't have the privilege that I have. And that's part of why I went to the police, because I thought, if I can't make this happen and I'm pretty credible as a witness, then how difficult is that going to be for somebody whose life has taken a different turn and they've needed drugs to medicate themselves because their trauma is so vast, and or chosen a career that then, you know, makes them as a witness not as credible. There's lots to factor in, and I think that, we're just set up. These people are even more set up to fail than I was. So that's why I'm talking about it.
I also love that you wrote the book, even though it didn't have that 1% outcome of a conviction, because I think that is so empowering as well. Because you took the steps, you filed a report, you pressed charges, and it didn't give it the outcome you wanted. But then you wrote a book about it too. You took it an extra step to write the book. And that I think is so incredibly powerful for others as well. Because I would think if this woman could do all of this and write a story about not succeeding at a conviction, then perhaps I can say something too.
Well, thank you. And that was I remember the moment sitting on the bed when I had chased up the outcome with the police. And I remember sitting there just being witness to myself, thinking, okay, so what does this mean? And part of me was excited because then I felt like it was my story to do what I wanted with. And it was exactly that. It was the feeling of, have I failed? And then reshaping that to say, no, I think the society has set us up to fail. And I want people to know that even though the statistics are against us in getting justice, that justice can be found in smaller steps along the way for our own healing. And really, at the end of the day, that is the most important part. If, one of my favorite poems, a Buddhist saying is, anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. And I was sick of drinking poison. This was not my poison to drink anymore. And I deserved to have a happy life. And so in those private moments, I wanted peace, not, this persisting kind of rage and frustration and doubt. So it was an important step.
Yeah. And justice does look different for everyone, but I like what you say, justice is healing.
Yeah.
That has to be part of it.
Yes. Yep. And it's about putting the pieces back together and, then handing it over. I think it's like that so many survivors carry this in isolation for so long that they forget that they're not responsible for someone else's actions. So this was me handing it back and saying, this is your story. I'm good. I was a gorgeous little innocent kid. You were a grown up who should have known better. So you can carry the pain of this. I'm done with it.
Yeah, and that is empowering. Um, just because I'm always so curious with, because I go to therapy and we're always talking about how things feel in your body, because I think for a lot of people, and definitely for myself, I can feel reactions before my brain recognizes I'm having that reaction. Looking back on your childhood, did you have any physical ailments that you could think of that could possibly be uh, tied to like a somatic response to what happened to you?
I remember strange behaviors in terms of, being at a family function and needing to pretend to go to the toilet halfway through, kind of kissing all my relatives goodbye, and that being quite profoundly timed so that I could avoid this particular person. Um, I remember having terrified of people coming into my bedroom at night. Um, and my mum got remarried, and the first night my stepdad stayed at our house, I slept in the cupboard because I was so scared. And so there were behaviors that didn't make sense for the rest of my personality and life. But I think it's also tricky to make sense of all those small things when 90% of the time you've got a very gregarious, happy person. And, that's what all of my reports said. Kath's a connector and she makes everyone feel great. And, so I think it's almost like that is a trauma response in itself and I believe I'm a good person and I love people. So it's hard to know what's trauma and what's, but yeah, I look back now and definitely um, there were dreams and there were fears, but I didn't know any different. That was the only life I'd ever known.
Oh, gosh, and it wasn't consistent. Wasn't an ongoing abuse that happened all the time to where it would be very clear to tie these isolated events that you did to something must have happened to you.
That's right. There was a person that I avoided, and there were, many family functions in which I believe I protected myself from further abuse. Um, but there were times when I got outsmarted, and my abuser was an alcoholic, and when my dad confronted him after I shared what had happened, his response was, I would never do that, but if I did do it, I don't remember because I'm an alcoholic. So, I mean, for me, that's an admission of guilt in itself, but that's also hiding behind blaming something else and someone else. And so that to me is what a victim attitude looks like. And I'm certainly not that.
Right. And that's definitely an easy way out, because people don't do those kind of things because of the influence of alcohol or drugs or
That's
anything.
right.
That's something that's in them.
Yeah.
Um, oh, goodness. Okay. Is there anything that you think we missed? Any topics that we didn't hit?
No, I don't think so. I think, that I touched on the fact that one of my greatest motivations was healing for the benefit of my children. I really wanted to show them that life won't always go your way. And, even this morning, we got a message I've got a very beautiful son who's got a big heart. And one of the dads sent my husband a message this morning with a snapshot of the girls in the class were teasing him, asking him if he had a crush on this particular girl, and he said no, and they said yes you do, and he said no I don't, I hate her. And so the little girl was really upset. So we had to sit him down this morning and he's like, I just didn't know how else to convince them that I didn't like her. And I said, I understand that, but there's consequences. Like, you can choose to be in that group or you can choose to exit, and you can, this isn't about being in trouble. This is about learning that that's not okay and you hurt someone's feelings and you need to own up and apologize. And you can make a decision. If you're going to get baited that easily, then just don't be on the group chat. So I think for me, it's very easy to separate my own feelings about who I am and what my childhood was, and then how I want to empower my children moving forward to be good humans because I've done the work. Whereas if I was still tied up in my own story, I might feel and project and make things not feel as easy as they do now. So, I see that happening a lot around me, people who haven't resolved their own things and they're projecting that onto their children. And I just really didn't want to do that for my kids. I want them to have better than that.
I just thought of a question. As an adult, are there any characteristics or personalities that you see in other adults that make you think, I want to keep my children away from that individual? Is there anything that other parents should look out for?
For me, it's very much an instinct. And I had a conversation recently with my daughter, who's now 14, and she said, I've always been allowed to go to sleepovers and stay at so many people's houses. And I said, I'm so glad you feel that way. I said, but count on your hand how many houses you actually stay at. And then she did. And she's like, oh. And I said, because I've spent a lot of time trusting my instinct about who's in those families. And there were situations where I didn't feel that trust. And so my kids haven't spent a lot of time at those houses. Does that mean that I'm going to protect them? I hope so. But the complex part about abuse is that it varies, and so do abusers. Anyone showing too much attention to your children is obviously a red flag for grooming. But grooming wasn't my story. My abuser was related to me, so they already had access and they already had my parents' trust. So my incidents were violent and they were quick and they were infrequent. And so I think changes in your children's behaviour, making sure that you communicate that if something happens, they can speak up. But just keeping them close and being present is the best defence. And not close in a sense that they're not having a life, but close in the sense that they feel safe enough to talk if they need to.
Okay, so once again, can you say the title of your book and how people can get it, and any links if they want to contact you?
My book is called The Courage to Speak Your Truth, Shifting the Narrative on Childhood Sexual Abuse, and you can find it on Amazon, at Audible, Spotify. I narrate it myself, so if my voice hasn't driven you crazy yet, you're welcome to jump on and listen to that.
I love your accent. I could listen to it all day.
My business is called Bespeak. So if you want to look me up, I'm on LinkedIn and Instagram and Facebook, and reach out. I'd love to know what you thought of the book if you read it, and just stay connected. And thank you so much, Ingrid, for this time. I've loved having this chat with you.
I really have loved this chat as well. I really enjoyed your book and with you narrating it as well.
Good, thank you.
But I think there was an amazing amount of good information and helpful information for everyone out there. And you've given so many good points. But do you have any specific words of wisdom or encouragement that you want to leave as a lasting statement with listeners?
I just want everyone to know that they deserve peace. Everyone deserves to feel peace, regardless of what has happened, what you've lost, what you've been through. I've yet to meet somebody who hasn't got a story, and that's not about measuring what story's worse or better. It's all relative for what we're carrying. But regardless of the story, you deserve peace and happiness. So do the work, not for forgiveness, but do the work before that peace and happiness for yourself.
Beautiful. Thank you again, Kath.
Thank you.
Thank you again for joining me today, Kath, and thank you, warriors, for listening. I've included the links Kath was referring to, as well as her 1 in 3 profile in the show notes. I will be back next week with another episode for you. Until then, stay strong, and wherever you are in your journey, always remember, you are not alone. Find more information, register as a guest, or leave a review by going to the website 1in3podcast.com. That's the number 1, the number 3, podcast.com. Follow 1 in 3 on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at 1 in 3 Podcast. To help me out, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe. 1 in 3 is a .5 Pinoy production. Music written and performed by Tim Crow.